To quote psychologist Carl Jung, in our postmodern world, we have forgotten the age-old fact that God often speaks chiefly through dreams and visions. Whenever I'm praying or wrestling through something, I usually end up dreaming about it. Well, the social and political unrest in our society this past year churned within me as I read chapters 11 and 12 of Bishop Curry's Love in Action this week. So after an unquiet mind, I wasn't too surprised when God continued this conversation in a dream. In this dream, I was strolling around the tidal basin at the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. Scent of cherry blossoms filled the air. It was a glorious spring day, much like this past Thursday here in Kansas City. Now, these particular cherry trees were a gift of friendship from Japan to the United States in 1912. As I walked through the intoxicating sweetness of the blossoms, the breeze from the nearby Potomac River blew across my face. The pink flowers, white monument, and perfect spring day suddenly transitioned into the dusty flatlands of eastern Colorado. Soon, I found myself at the Granada National Historic Site, the remains of a relocation camp where the U.S. government interned Americans of Japanese descent after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I heard the warning rattle of a venomous snake as the shadows of human beings, herded by soldiers, moved into the camp. I began to pray. What can I do in the midst of such hate? Then, fortunately for me, Presiding Bishop Michael Curry and the good people of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Seattle, Washington, crashed my dream in vivid Technicolor. So a little background on these heroes in my dream. Bishop Michael Curry, our presiding bishop, you already know him. Now, St. Peter's is a Japanese-American congregation where I worshiped during the summer of my CPE, or chaplaincy training internship, when I was at the VA Puget Sound Health System in Seattle. The eldest members of St. Peter's lived in internment camps like Granada between 1942 and 1945, after the U.S. government relocated Americans of Japanese descent away from the West Coast. But back to my dream. I'm still stuck in the internment camp, shadows closing in around me. I asked the presiding bishop and people of St. Peter's the question again: what can I do in the midst of such hate? The presiding bishop winked at me and said, "Love, act, share." Everyone else nodded. I thought I might be beginning to understand, but I had more questions. But then Tiberius Kitten decided that it was time for breakfast. He yowled me awake, and this particular chat with God, courtesy of my unconscious mind, came to a quick end. In 2017, the Episcopal Diocese of Olympia marked the 75th anniversary of the U.S. government's internment of 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent by recording stories of members of St. Peter's Seattle who experienced internment personally. Their interviews, titled Justice Interrupted, are available on the church's website. Member Ben Kodama shared during his interview how he became a facilitator for racial healing and reconciliation work later in his life to ensure, through education and community activism, that no other communities experienced what his had. Mr. Kodama reflected on how the injustice occurred. It wasn't the Constitution that failed us, he concluded. It was the people who were supposed to uphold it, who failed us. Mr. Kodama and the other interred Japanese Americans experienced firsthand what happens when, to quote Bishop Curry, the panoply or complete collection of dark isms, racism, nationalism, nativism, sexism, and so on, rear their ugly heads in our public sphere. Systemic racism, like what the eldest generation of St. Peter's endured, is the exact opposite of love your neighbor as yourself. No one would segregate themselves from the rest of society. No one would choose to be interred. Yet we as a nation, in our public sphere, have treated neighbors this way. It's not love. It's selfishness. Our collective failure to treat our neighbors as fellow beloved of God. Bishop Curry personally applies the golden rule test when it comes to politics. If he wouldn't want to be treated that way himself, he will not support policies or legislation that treats others that way. Bishop Curry is very clear. We are called to engage with our democracy and our leadership so that the laws of the land reflect shared human values of compassion, mercy, and care for people and the planet. I had the privilege this past Friday to attend a webinar where Bishop Curry said more about how he believes Jesus might engage politics in the public sphere. Here is my takeaway of the conversation between Bishop Curry and Dr. Catherine Meeks, Executive Director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. Jesus wasn't a Republican or a Democrat. He would have definitely voted, and when Jesus voted, he would support legislation that actualized God's dream for the world: mercy, compassion, and care for all, no matter what political party sponsored that legislation. Don't do what Jesus would do if he were in your shoes, Bishop Curry cautions us, because that gives you time to filter what you would do through your own ego to make it safe and comfortable for you. Instead, notice what Jesus did in the gospel narrative, then do likewise. So in this morning's gospel reading, let's see what Jesus actually did. Jesus and his disciples join the stream of pilgrims at Passover, arriving in Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies, where the Jews believed that God lived. Jesus notices right away that something's off. The temple itself is crowded by mooing, squawking animals and their accompanying fur, feathers, and feces. These animals, the vendors selling them, and the temple's religious authorities who authorize their permits to sell, all are desecrating a sacred space. Jesus doesn't turn around or walk away. He's not quiet to keep the peace. He acts boldly, physically removing the animals from the space with a whip and calling out the vendors on their transgression. Why have you made my Father's house a marketplace? When Jesus expels the livestock desecrating God's house and the temple, the Greek word is the same word used when Jesus casts out or exorcises demons. Now, these poor sheep and cows themselves weren't evil. Whether those vendors were themselves corrupt, as one commentary I read argues, or whether they were there at the command of Caiaphas, the dubiously ethical high priest and member of Good Friday's evil triumvirate with Judas and Pontius Pilate, well, it doesn't really matter. It was the proximity to the sacred space that the Jews deemed unclean. So Jesus took action. Did he disturb those around him? Most certainly. Did he make waves? Oh, indeed. Did Caiaphas and the other potentially most likely corrupt leaders notice? Well, as the author of John notes, this temple scene foreshadows Jesus' death on the cross as a political enemy of the Judeo-Roman state. Everyone noticed. Jesus was decisive. He was bold. He lived out love as a verb. Everybody noticed. How could they not? Imagine the commotion and confusion when Jesus cracked the whip to clear the temple's entrance. I attempted to herd goats once myself on a home visit to a remote Lynn County, Kansas farm. The goats scattered everywhere in an explosion of hooves and dust, and that particular black chaplain jacket never quite recovered. Everyone will notice when we act in love, especially those whose humanity is restored and whose hope is rekindled by our actions. The memories of Mr. Kodima and the other members of St. Peter's interred during World War II brought tears to my eyes this week as I watched their interviews. For 75 years, they remained silent in the public sphere. They could just as easily remain silent for the rest of their lives. Yet they spoke up with the support of their bishop, acting boldly in the hope that their stories might change those who listen, those with power in the public sphere to shape policies and laws that promote the justice and dignity of fellow human beings. I've experienced the same boldness in Bishop Curry's narrative of the African American communities who have helped shape his life and ministry. Bishop Curry shares his story, in my opinion, so that those who listen might be inspired and changed, inspired to act boldly in love. For in our public sphere, the spaces where we live, work, vote, and dream, like Jesus' temple in Jerusalem, those spaces are God's. We sanctify them with mercy and compassion. We desecrate them with passivity and selfishness. It's no surprise to me that the National Mall in Washington, D.C. ended up in my dream this week. It's a sacred public space for me. True, it was my favorite escape from the grind of seminary classwork, but so much history, such powerful monuments, not just to those who founded us, but to those who fell for us, and those assassinated for challenging our insidious isms. I still haven't made sense of the news footage of the U.S. Capitol being overrun on January 6th. The question from my dream, what can I do in the midst of such hate, remains with me. I pray to be patient and kind, but to listen, learn, and act, that I might contribute to the sanctification of our public space, especially our sparkling corner of it here at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. In light of Jesus' bold, messy love as action in the Temple Square, I'm starting to get Bishop Curry's advice to me in my dream. God's love isn't safe and comfy, polite and passive. It won't be what I'm used to, and it won't retain all the values instilled in me as a child. Stepping outside my comfort zone is a given if I'm going to love as a verb. God's love moves and shakes and ultimately breaks the foundations of systemic racism and other isms that threaten the security of our public sphere. For if everyone, fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image and God's likeness, is not celebrated, while those who embody the dark isms thrive, our republic of the people, as in belonging to everyone, our republic fails. The Japanese American congregation of St. Peter's, Seattle, taught a young seminarian how to befriend neighbors who were different, as they included others who were traditionally or outside their traditional community in their worship and parish feast every Sunday. 17 years later, our presiding bishop has taught this new assistant rector to take listening up a notch, act boldly and concretely in love, as Jesus did in the public sphere, and God's dream may just become a reality here on earth. We can reclaim the sanctity of our public sphere. We can engage politics together in our families, neighborhoods, and communities. We can safeguard freedom while championing diversity. First, we have to talk to each other, especially talk to our neighbors whose political views differ from our own. Here's my takeaway of Bishop Curry's call to us to act in love within the public sphere. It's exactly what Bishop Curry said in my dream to dispel the darkness of the internment camp. Love, act, share. First, love. Don't engage politics on its own terms. Shift the conversation to a higher ground. Act. Reach out to someone whose beliefs, values, or life experience differs from your own. Yes, this means actually talk to them. And share. Search for what you have in common: beliefs, values, life experiences. Begin there. Community will follow. Jesus didn't turn around. He didn't walk away and disengage. Neither can we. It's not who we are, and it's not who God calls us to be. What can we do in the midst of hate? Sanctify our public sphere together, one kind word, one conversation, one good deed, one vote, one dream at a time. The glorious cherry trees in Washington, D.C., so vivid in my memory. Our government gifted cuttings of them back to the city of Tokyo in 1991, so the Japanese could continue replacing the original parent trees destroyed by U.S. bombers during World War II. Friendships can be rekindled and renewed. Love, act, share. God's dream for us now.